So last week, we got a brief introduction to the book of Colossians, and we're going to continue to look into the book of Colossians. Um, I'm hoping that some of us have had a chance to read the book. It's not all that long, kind of really packed with a lot of awesome things. And today we're going to focus on things above in the book of Colossians. I'm going to show you a very rough outline, a very macro sort of outline of the book. You can kind of break it down pretty much in half, Colossians chapter 1 and 2 compared to Colossians chapter 3 and 4. And in chapter 1, we start out with just an introduction, as pretty much all of Paul's epistles do. He talks about his prayers to the Colossians, for the Colossian saints, and you get some idea of what his relationship is there, which we talked some about last week. And he talks quite a bit about the gospel and redemption and how those things work, and the what we're walking in and what the Colossians are walking in terms of redemption. And in that, part of the focus is on avoiding what we sometimes in our day refer to as legalism. And we've looked in the past in our studies of the New Testament, the book of Acts and the epistles, on how much Paul put into the epistles addressing something that was very specific that they were dealing with in that time. Because remember, this is obviously the transition from the Old Testament era to the New Testament era. And so the believers in the one true and living God in the Old Testament era, how you practice that belief was through Moses' law. And it was a pretty tough transition for a lot of people. In some aspects, it's understandable. It's only natural. If you're transitioning away from tradition that has been your culture since long before you were ever born, and you've grown up cherishing it and appreciating it and trying to live it, that's pretty tough to transition away from. And so some of it is just only natural. It's just going to be that way. But then there are also those who wouldn't let go or didn't want to let go for, you might say, nefarious reasons. They liked the power that they had. They didn't want any change. And they literally resented the notion that Christ was breaking down some of these barriers and replacing some of the old with some new and better. So that was a issue. That was a particular thing that was actively interjected into these young churches, and a false message that came to them on fairly regular basis. And so Paul combated those things actively in person and in his epistles. So that's part of what we see going on there. Then we come out of there where he's kind of let himself get pulled into just addressing that aspect of things. And then he sort of emerges out of that in Colossians chapter 3, says this is where our focus needs to be, on things above. And so in that context, he gives a lot of encouragement and instruction on what that means and what the priorities need to be and how to live for God in this New Testament era of liberty. And then there's a closing, as in most epistles. When you're wanting to understand the history and the specifics, facts of the locations and the people and the progress of things, a lot of times in these epistles, you can really look into the introductions and the closings. Paul does a lot of mentioning of relevant people, and sometimes you can recognize references to certain journeys and things like that. So there's some good stuff like that in the closing of Colossians. In the first two chapters, in the process of kind of addressing these things, Paul writes a lot of things that are just packed with information that's worth unpacking. Paul Paul has a way of, as he's writing, to kind of inspire himself into the next thing. Conversations a lot of times flow to where at the end of a conversation, you're not talking about really the same thing you were talking about at the beginning, right? Somebody says something, you're talking about something, but then as something about that is said, it sort of triggers somebody off onto something related but different, and then something else and so forth. Well, that's how conversation works, and that's fun. You ever speak to someone who sort of does that by themselves? And you're waiting to be involved in a conversation, but here they've springboard onto another thing and another thing and another thing before you've been able to address anything that was said, and now they're already talking about some three things different than what they were at the beginning. That's kind of Paul sometimes, and the writings of Paul, he'll be really saying something, and then a particular phrase of how he's saying it at the end of 3 or 4 verses kind of inspires him on to elaborate on that phrase, which is related but not the same thing. So that manner of writing is part of what can make it kind of tough to read and understand the epistles sometimes, because you can get a little bit lost sometimes. At least I can. Let me put it that way. And so it's worth kind of putting a little bit of labor into what have we got here, and how do we put that together? A lot of times he'll end up addressing the same things, but separated from one another, because he's talking about it and then he got himself off on a little bit of a tangent and then another tangent. Then he comes back around to that same thing again. And it all, if you can absorb it all and digest it all, even the stuff that was tangent can illuminate the original topic. So it's really fun, but it is labor sometimes to dig into these passages of scripture and see what's in there. So some of the topics that are powerful and awesome that he does give a lot of valuable comments relating to in those first 2 chapters. He talks about his ministry and his calling, which gives insight into just ministry in general and how the calling of God works. Prayer, we can get some valuable example about prayer there. The gospel, understanding the gospel. I mean, the gospel is a catchword that we're all extremely familiar with, but what really is the gospel? How does it really work? You can get some insight into that in there. Redemption, and what it means to be redeemed. How did redemption take place? How did God do it? How does he extend it to us? We can learn a lot about that in the things that Paul writes in these first 2 chapters. The body of Christ is mentioned in more than one place, and with some context, some pretty fascinating stuff to get some understanding. And the body of Christ, of course, is a subject of other places in the New Testament. Colossians has some great insight into it, and a really fun topic to dig into is the identity of Jesus Christ, the man that walked the earth for 33 years and worked all of those miracles. Who was that guy? And what should we really understand about who and what he was? There's a lot of insight into that in the book of Colossians, particularly in these first 2 chapters. These are topics that we are going to get into in the upcoming few weeks here, and really do our best to unpack what the phrases that are interwoven with one another throughout these chapters tell us. So I would encourage you to continue. Probably you did read the book of Colossians over some point in the past week. Read it again, and maybe make a note of this list of topics, and be on the lookout to see what you see that these chapters tell us about these topics. But for today, I want us to jump over all of that. Those are sort of foundational and sort of rambling around, but I like to where he emerges in chapter 3 onto the things above. And so I want us to just see how far we get on Paul's teachings on the things above, leaving behind the old, and how do we get into the new. So Colossians chapter 3 verse 1 says, if ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. So this is our mindset. This is our mentality. Get your mind on the next world. Get your mind on spiritual things. Focus your attention. And then verse 3 says, for ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. I mean, one way to take this is to say, hey, look, your life on earth, in a sense, you're already dead. So what difference do earthly things even make? We're moving forward. We're moving to something better. Let's go ahead and occupy ourselves with the things that are relevant to the next world rather than this world. So how do we do that? Verse 4, when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall ye also appear with him in glory. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth. Your members is a way of him referring to your body, which more often in the New Testament, the point that he's referring to here is referred to as your flesh, the carnal, the natural, our carnal ways, our fleshly leanings. The Galatians refers to the lusts of our flesh. And Paul's saying, let's wipe those things out. What are these things? What are these lusts of our flesh? Well, the obvious: fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, which concupiscence is another word for lust, for immoral lusts, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Now, this whole list is pretty tied to one area of fleshly leaning, and some of these things you could definitely blur the lines into some other areas, but it's a pretty clear focus on immoral physical things. And so even covetousness applies in that, because that's sort of what it comes down to, is craving something outside of what is rightfully in your area to consume. Covetousness: I want theirs. I don't just want what's here. I want what's out there. And that's idolatry. That's lifting your affections, and by extension, your worship and your service, to something outside of what God has seen fit to give you. That's what covetousness is all about. It's idolatry, because you are elevating your opinion of those things that you want that God hasn't given you above your opinion of God. So that's idolatry. That covetousness, it does tie into the context of the other four things on this list, but it also does clearly extend far beyond that. You can covet after all sorts of things, and not just the things that are related to this list. If you're coveting after, so it's, there's a shading difference here, distinction here. It's not that it's wrong to want something. It's certainly not wrong to set goals and to achieve things. That's not what the Bible teaches against. The Bible teaches those things very much so. I love a verse in Proverbs. It says, through desire, a man having separated himself seeketh and intermeddleth with all wisdom. And then that couples with, I'll tell you what I see in that verse, but that couples with verses in Proverbs say, a man's gift will make room for him. Another says, See a man who's diligent in his business, he's going to keep company with kings, not with mediocre people. The verse, this is a little bit of a sidetrack. It's just something I love. The verse about through desire, a man having separated himself, seeketh and intermeddleth with all wisdom. That's addressing how people excel at things, whether it be sports or business or music or cooking. Something gets in you that you have a desire and a love for this certain thing. And a person who has that separates himself from what everybody else is doing because I relate to this as a musician. My experience with music is that I've sat alone in my room playing guitar for hours at a time while I don't know what anybody else is doing. I'm not interested because I have a vision of where I could get musically and a desire to be there. And then in the process, that person seeks and intermeddles with all wisdom. Wisdom meaning knowing about what to do in a certain situation, in a certain arena. So you learn because you apply yourself through desire. Anyway, my point relating to this is that the Bible does not teach against pursuing things. But the Bible does teach us to pursue things and to be diligent. And that if we are diligent in pursuing things that we desire, things that we see that we could attain unto and could grow into, then that gifting will make room for us where we'll find ourselves among great people and not just mediocre people, because we've been diligent in applying ourselves to the desire that's in us. So that kind of a desire to attain unto something is not the same thing as covetousness. And sometimes it may be hard to, from the outside, to define the difference, or to look at somebody and say, oh, no, because that you're wanting, that's covetous. But that this other person is wanting, that's just good desire, good godly desire. So it's up to us to discern that. It's up to us to make that distinction and call ourselves to account and hold ourselves to a standard that we don't allow covetousness to get in us. The Apostle Paul said, I've learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I can have a desire, I can be diligent in my pursuit, but at the same time, I need to be content with where I am and with what situation God has placed me in, as opposed to being unsatisfied and resentful. That's kind of an earmark of, if I'm embracing covetousness, I'm resentful of the fact that I don't have that. That's different than having a desire that I can channel and apply myself to grow into an attainment. You see what I mean? So we need to check ourselves, and the flesh wants to do all the things on this list. The fleshly nature is to be unsatisfied and resentful, and to just think, I should have this, that, and the other. People should do this, that, and the other for me. This person should treat me this certain way. That's covetousness. And you're elevating yourself and your flesh's desires above the hand of God. That's idolatry. So watch out for that. This is things above. This is how we elevate above this world and above the entrapments and the nature that is built into us. But God, through his Spirit, gives us a way to elevate above it. Back up to the first word of this verse. It's about mortifying. Now back up to the study we've done on prayer. It's about surrendering myself to God in prayer. It's about crucifying the flesh. It's about submitting as Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's how we can get to a place. You see, what Paul is distinguishing here, he's contrasting. Remember the context we didn't read, but I've just mentioned it. In chapter 2, he's talking about legalism. Now in chapter 3, saying, hey, but we're leaving that stuff behind and we're focusing on things above. But he doesn't contrast it by saying, now that we're not legalists, we just do whatever. That's not the contrast. The contrast is that the legalism is, okay, I'm not going to do these things because I'm told not to do it, so I just have to just not do it. No, the things above is get yourself focused on spirituality, connect yourself to the Spirit of God, and that will literally kill off these things. Now, they will rise again the next morning. You got to keep doing it every day, but you're going to get free of these things and not do them by the power of the Spirit, not by the authority of a commandment, but by the power of the Spirit. That's your hope to escape these things. Verse 6 says, for which things' sake, the things on this list, the wrath of God cometh on the children of disobedience. We want to be children of obedience, not children of disobedience. In the which ye also walked sometime when ye lived in them. So it said, all of us have done this stuff. All of us we're all cut from the same cloth. We're all made of the same kind of flesh. We can't look down on anyone because we all did the things. But now you also put off. So you did these things, but through the Spirit, you can put them off. And he's going to give us a new list now. Not only that sinful, immoral behaviors, but let's go a little farther. Put off these things too. Anger. Let's get past anger. Let's get in a spirit of love. When you allow God to really transform you in your prayer, and if you have the infilling of the Spirit of God, and then you reconnect to the liveliness of God's Spirit in your prayers, get your mind transformed, you become so loving and compassionate. You can still be firm and strong, but you have such love and compassion for people because you begin to see them the way God sees them. And God sees them the same way he sees me, which I'm so grateful for, is not to be, he sees the good in me and he sees the potential in me. Well, you start to see people the same way. And so when things happen that would make you angry, through the Spirit, you get past anger and you get to a different mindset because of how you see things. So in addition to putting off these physical immoralities, let's also put off anger. Let's put off wrath. Let's put off malice. Malice is wishing harm to anyone in one way or another, just doing something on the motivation of it having a negative impact on someone else. And you may not want to admit that you've done that, but that's the fleshly nature. If you're not walking in the Spirit, the word that may be more common for us than this word malice is the word malicious, right? It's the same thing, malice, malicious. If you're not walking in the Spirit, there are going to be some things that put you into a certain state of mind where you do some things that are just malicious, just to make something hard on somebody else. And something drives you to do that. Well, you know what it is that drives you to do that? It's your flesh. It's your nature. You're that way. I'm that way. But through the Spirit, we can elevate beyond these things and get into things above. Blasphemy. Blasphemy is saying things against God, right? Well, where does that come from? It comes from pride and ego. It comes from a fleshly mindset. When the flesh just really becomes empowered and running the show, a full manifestation and extension of the mindset of the flesh is that I'm the top dog, and anybody who is in my way is a problem, and anybody who that what they're pulling for is contradictory to what I'm pulling for is a problem. And when we really go with that natural mindset, even God gets in that category of against what I'm trying to do. And that's where blasphemy comes from this headstrong carnal nature, that we end up being so headstrong and so focused on our drives and our desires that anything could come out of our mouth, even things that are blasphemous to God Almighty. Filthy communication out of your mouth. This is the fleshly nature. And if you do not walk in the Spirit, you'll find yourself on the other side of these kinds of attitudes and actions and words. Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds. So part of the old man, the carnal man, the natural man, the flesh, you put these things off with the deeds of the flesh. So the things above, it's not about the way we live doesn't matter. It's about the Spirit is our deliverance to live well. And lying is part of the old man. So, all right, let's continue here. Verse 9 was what we just read. I want to kind of use that going on. Lie not one to another, seeing that ye have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. You want to know another fleshly tendency? It's to band together, us against them. That's a really deep, carnal, natural thing that people do. We band together into an us against them. You want to call it tribal, you want to, whatever you want to call it. And that's not godly, because Christ is all and in all. And standing before the Lord, these categories, these labels are completely meaningless. Greek, Jew, barbarian, Scythian, bond, free, slave, master. None of these things are relevant, because we are all on an even playing field when we answer to God. God sees us all the same as one another. And so racism has no place in a godly mindset. We are all the same, and we are all struggling with things, and we all need God, the same Christ, the same way. Even he throws in circumcision nor uncircumcision. And again, this is connecting to what he addresses back in Colossians chapter 2, where what is sometimes referred to as the Judaizers, the Old Testament followers, are trying to impose the Old Testament policies on the New Testament church. And so he talks about circumcision a little bit in chapter 2, and he's saying, see, this is the deal. These things don't matter. There's no difference between those that are of the circumcision culture and those that are of the uncircumcision culture. We all have the same needs before God. So we're renewed in knowledge. All of us need the same renewal. All of us need the change in our mindset that will, let me say this too, in terms of there's neither this nor that. Brace yourself now. There's neither Republican nor Democrat. Now, there are principles that are godly and principles that are not godly, but don't put your confidence in any politician or political party to be faithful to godliness and to be godly. There's no godly, the world is not godly, period. And so we are putting our affections on things above. We do what we need to do as responsible elements, members of our society. I vote for what I think may be the closest it could be to godly principles, but I don't have any confidence ultimately in any of that. And you will not find me pulled into a political battle where I'm banded in with either side or even some third party or whatever, because you get yourself tied into some stuff that you're not expecting to. Ultimately, we have our mind on things above, and we want to connect to things above, and a mindset that recognizes that all people need God. You either are walking with God or you're not. And even that's not an us against them. It's an us for them. It's an us for us and an us for them. And we just want to be used of God to be a blessing, whether it's to a brother or sister, or whether it's to someone who's in desperate need of God. So don't get pulled into any banding together of people in a fleshly way. Verse 12, put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved. These are the things we want. Paul talked about the things that we don't want, right? And we use the Spirit to elevate and escape these tendencies of the flesh. So here's what we do want to embrace and recognize the Spirit producing in us. Bowels of mercy, bowels being the deep part of you, mercy that comes from your deep part, your heart. Kindness, can we do that? Humbleness of mind. Meekness. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is that you've got the power to affect a situation, but you're really careful about it to make sure you don't hurt anyone in the process. That's what meekness is all about. Even if it means accepting some hurt coming your way. You don't just bow up just because something comes against you, because you may end up hurting someone in the process. Long suffering, which is patience, and then expanding on that long suffering, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. This is what spiritual looks like. All that other stuff, that's what carnal looks like. This is what spiritual looks like. Now, you can't fulfill these things in the great sense that we need it by just saying do, don't. You have to access the Spirit of God, but it does take some active choices on our part to set our affection on things above. You ever heard anybody say, well, I just can't help what I like? Sometimes people might say that about a person that they have a relationship with. You can't help who you fall in love with. Well, that's really not true. You do have some choices. You can, through some of your choices, you can find yourself in a place where bonds feel very strong and are very strong. And it can be a very, very real thing, that it's not just simple to just turn on and off, but you do have choices in the process of getting there or not getting there. And you can set your affection in a direction. And that's what the Bible has instructed us to do here in Colossians 3, is to set our affection on things above, and not just say, well, I wish I had kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, but I just find myself with anger and malice and fornication and all this stuff. Okay, well, you need deliverance. You need the Spirit of God. So make some choices to set your affection on the things above, and to set your face and your direction towards the Lord. And, God is merciful, gracious, and forgiving, and you can count on that. But that doesn't mean that you just sit and wallow. You need to turn and set your direction, set your affection, and set your desires in the right direction. Forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. And above all these things, put on charity, which means love, which is the bond of perfectness. And the reason charity is above all these things is because charity generates all of these things, and charity defeats all of those other things. So this is the pinnacle of these spiritual things, is charity. It's the summation of them all. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to the which also ye are called in one body, and be ye thankful. And let's leave it right there for today.